Hello and welcome to the Nordic Mythology Podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Matthias Nordvig.
Hello. Our guest this evening, morning, depending on where we are at. I guess it's actually evening for you, Daniel, and midday for you, Jason, and morning for me. Our guest is Jason Ralls, author of the book The Oath, Heathen Poets Journey. And aside from that, Jason, you're just a guy. Is that how you explain yourself?
That's the correct summation. I am just a guy who happens to like language and the Norse pantheon.
Cool. Welcome to the channel.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's the most South thing that's been said yet. I just love how people from the South say y'all. It's like it's just such a synonymous thing. As soon as I hear it, I just think of the South of.
Yeah, my favorite is to combine it with the Viking skjall or skull, y'all. That's also good.
Skull, y'all.
Skull, y'all.
So all you need is a horn. The horn to lift up. So how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Just sitting here and enjoying this book has taken off unexpectedly and been successful. Your first book's not supposed to be successful. It's supposed to just disappear into the slush pile, and then you go back at it. So when it's actually successful, and then you end up on a podcast with some prominent folks in your community, it's surreal is a word I use a lot lately.
I think you're giving us too much credit, to be fair. I would say we had some guys as well.
Yeah, there you go. A guy and some guys. That fits.
That's it. I mean, to be fair, that sounds like we're heading into some sort of porno there. So
I know what. No, okay.
Yeah,
So is this the first book you've written, or have you written others before, maybe that haven't necessarily been finished? Because you always hear that thing of there's billions of books that have started but never actually finished. So I guess that's the hardest thing, is finishing a book as well.
I have dozens of unfinished novels, mostly speculative fiction, fantasy, worlds that will probably never see the light of day. So there's definitely that. Actually, when the coronavirus hit and the lockdown came, and I was kind of just depressed, as everyone was, I did polish off a short story of mine, turn it is set in a second world fantasy type thing. And put that up on Amazon as an ebook. Sold 5 copies to my friends, and so that did give me a taste of how to operate in KDP and Amazon and kind of metrics, and you sell your 3 copies to somebody, and suddenly you're on a chart somewhere, and you can see that and how it performs. So it did give me a little bit of taste of the process early on, I guess, which is fortuitous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so obviously this book is in poetry form. Now, I guess most of the sagas are kind of poetically written. So, have you, when writing it, did you go back and study kind of the way that they were written, or did you kind of follow your own path, or what? How did that work?
Well, so of course, most of our understanding of the past and how the Norse gods and before them Germanic deities were worshipped and interacted with is based on the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda and a couple of the medieval Eddas and stuff. So poetry is very important, and I guess it just made sense. So I started an Instagram account early in the year to sort of interact with the online heathen community, because before that it was just not something I really did. But then I saw that this social media presence and people on YouTube and Instagram, it seemed to be kind of a community forming where you could actually contact people, unlike in the past. So I started an Instagram account, and all I did was I took some art, put a quote from the Havamal on it, as you do, and release it. And it was like, oh, this is nice. And I just had this idea. It was like, So I've written poetry my whole life. I love language. There's something about taking a sentence and putting it on a page and then coming back and editing that sentence and kind of trimming the fat off of it, making it cleaner, kind of making it sing, and the kind of emotions you can evoke with that's always spoken to me. So honestly, I went back recently and threw up an old poem on my Patreon that I wrote several years ago, and I went back and read it and was like, oh, this is a narrative journey into the underworld. Way before I was doing any kind of pagan stuff with my writing. But it just kind of came out organically that I was on Instagram. I was like, well, I'll just put a poem up to these Norse deities, and I put something up, and it got a lot of traction. I was like, this is an enjoyable process. I'll keep doing it. And then it just kind of took off. One of my poems was really strong, and it was about Idun, the goddess of eternal youth, and who's also married to Bragi, who's the god of poetry. And so there's like a really powerful, I think, conversation you can have there about the link between art and immortality. There's something really there. All these myths and deities speak to things that are deep within us. So I just started following her on like a narrative poetic journey. And next thing you know, I'm in hell, I'm talking to Tyr, and it just kind of evolved into this thing. It took me a few months, and I was like, I've got a book. And then I went of make it, and here we are.
So it was more of an accident, I guess, than...
Yeah, and creativity, and I'm not sure if you have the same experience with crafting your horns, but I've never sat down and say, I'm gonna plot this out, and it's gonna have, here's the beginning hook, here's the middle, here's the climax, and here's where I wrap it all in. It's more like a feeling of how things could go, and then especially with writing, as you put one or the other, the very nature of the medium you operate in, the very structure of the words on the page are pushing you down certain avenues. And so I just kind of follow it. And, and this is hooked up to my spirituality, which is heathen, Asatru, Norse pagan, however you want to call it. So as I'm writing these poems, I'm also making offerings to these deities, meditating on them. And it's kind of linked, so really, I feel like I may have invented my own genre. It's kind of shamanic poetry, basically. So instead of beating a drum, I just write, and it's very...
It's an exploration, right? Like you start on a path. This is how I have. There's like a million trails around me in the national forests right up here in the mountains, and like that's how I walk when I hike, right? I just I follow a path, and then it'll take me somewhere unknown, and usually it turns out great. Once in a while you have to turn around because there's an angry moose on the trail or something like that. But that's the general flow of it all, right? It's an exploration, and I really like this idea that of like adding ritual to the process itself. I mean, this is added value, so to speak, and this is a method that you see a lot of people using these days. I think the most prominent examples are musicians like Heilung and Wardruna. Einar Selvik, for instance, has talked about this, where he he goes out into the woods, and then he takes branches from a birch tree that has branches in the eastern direction. He takes those branches. He doesn't take any branch. He doesn't take a wooden leg from an IKEA table. No, he takes those because that adds value to the process and what he is creating. And to be honest, from that very rationalistic approach, you'd say that's nonsense. But I think it goes to show that what we're seeing these days is that bands like that, they're really taking off. A lot of people are really connecting and relating to that. Just like a lot of people are really connecting and relating to literature written from similar types of perspectives, right? There's something to that. It adds extra value and flavor. So I think it sounds like an awesome journey that you've been on.
Yeah, and it's been really surprising how people have reacted to it. I've had people read my book and cry and tell me that they cried. And I don't know how to process that. That's, what I'm trying to do here is take, something I went through and it's something I experienced spiritually and put it on a page, but to have it evoke emotions in others is really, has been a very special and interesting experience for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. I bet that really is a humbling experience. I guess, we sometimes get little messages here and there about the podcast about how people, they'll listen to it when they're exercising or, doing stuff, and just little messages, they mean an awful lot to get, just knowing that you kind of, I guess, to a point, with me and Matthias, we're on episode 36 now. If each one's an hour and a half long, you look, this is my maths getting tested, but you're looking at maybe 45 hours of material of people, if you've listened to every episode of us just speaking. And I guess to a point, people probably feel like they know us without actually meeting us. And I know that because I listen to a lot of podcasts myself. So I know that, when I'm listening to people, you do get that sense of knowing somebody without physically knowing them, but you do, you do kind of know we are very honest on this. So, you get a sense of who we are. And I mean, I assume that kind of comes through with the poetry as well, because they say with you obviously go to a very personal place when you write, so people get that sense from it.
Yeah, and I think with art, so one of my favorite quotes is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but he basically says that genius is saying what everybody else already feels in their heart, and when they see the words written down, it comes back to them with a kind of alien majesty, and that always really resonated with me. I think when somebody's super honest and brutal and raw, there's going to be some portion of the community out there that feel exactly the same way, because human experience is very the same experiences and the same feelings. So that's going to resonate. Although when you're doing it, it doesn't feel like it. And certainly I feel like an imposter half the time. It's very strange. When people say nice things to you, you want to be like, oh, no, that's not, I'm not that, that's not me. But at the same time, you have to accept it with a certain bit of grace so that you can move forward and keep communicating that value.
Absolutely. So, I mean, when it comes to the actual writing of the poem, you said before that you kind of like trim the fat off. Is it a case of that you just write in full sentences as you kind of like are just, I guess it's almost kind of in a zone, or right, just putting stuff down and then you go back over it and trim it, or do you try and write in poem form?
Yeah, start off trying to make it a poem, with like line breaks and everything, and I just my way through the language, but it changes. So basically, I take the images I'm seeing in my head, because a lot of times it's imagery. It's like visualization, like if you go on like a guided meditation where walking through the forest and I'm writing down about the trees and the way the leaves smell, and you're picking out the key things that really evoke the experience. And you just do your best to get it down, and then you go back later and you read it and you think, well, actually, when I said that branch was gray, it would be better to say that it was like the sea tossing in the evening or something. Or sometimes you say, oh, I said the sea was tossing in the evening and the breeze was flowing, and you're like, it was just gray. You don't need all that. And you go back and forth, trimming the language down to make it sing. And in my case, and I think this is important for people that are wanting to follow my path of making a book and releasing it in the world, make sure that if you're going to write something, especially poetry, send it to somebody else. So I had an editor work over every one of my lines and send it back to me, and that was a conversation back and forth. Because again, with the ease of self-publication these days, it is easy to just throw stuff down there and just put it out there, and that's not doing yourself a service either.
Somebody honest as well, I guess. So somebody who isn't maybe like a parent or a loved one, who's
going to preferably a professional, because we live in an economy where you can go on all these websites and you can find, like I found a magnificent cover artist. I think her Instagram is Alchemist of the Arts, and she does these beautiful bind runes. And I worked with her to make the cover, and that makes the book. And then I found an editor. I basically put in my Instagram stories. It's like, hey, I'm looking for a somebody that can edit poetry, but also has my same spiritual kind of viewpoint, and somebody who answered, and I was able to have her work through the lines with me. It was important to have somebody that had a bit of technical mastery, but also the same kind of feelings I have, so that she could appreciate what I was trying to do.
Absolutely, because especially when it's such a personal journey, you don't want somebody to then come and put their stamp on it almost and change it. But then I guess that's what a good editor does, is that they take their own personal feelings out of it and just, sort the words out, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely worked well.
Before we get too far away, I guess I found it really interesting how you were explaining that it is more like a visual journey. And I guess, I'm no writer, so I guess I don't go through that process. But that was something that kind of lit up with me, just thinking. It made me see. I guess it kind of just made me think of it differently. Just in your mind seeing it, and it is physically, a journey for you. I guess you're traveling through it and writing down what you see, what you feel, and it is actually very much so like a wandering through the whole mythology.
Yeah, for me, it's a bit of a shamanic memoir, I guess you could call it, because to me, all of these experiences happened. I can still, where the clearing where I meet Odin, and where Odin for me is I get this from a lot of people that interact with him in that kind of way. Very distant figure, always busy. Sometimes you have some interaction that's very powerful, but sometimes very distant and moving around. But that, for like the weeks that I was writing that poem, that clearing was there in my mind, and he was there the whole time, never wandered. And it was just, and even now that clearing is a special place within my head. And again, this might make more sense to people that do things like shamanic journeying and have places in kind of an altered state within their mind that they go for like visualized journeys. But there's like, it's a physical location now that I can go to and jump off into other poems. But yeah, it's very, again, very interesting and unique experience to participate in.
So it's not necessarily a single journey in one sitting. It's kind of, it's just a place you almost build within yourself that you can come in and out of, and I guess visit when you choose, almost.
Yeah, it's almost. So we're going to get kind of scientific here for a second. So I am what you call, and I think I'm going to use the right language, you can correct me if I don't, but hyperphasic. So a lot of people don't realize, there's aphasic and hyperphasic. So if you go in your mind and can you visualize, for example, a chalkboard, and you see the chalkboard now, it's black. Perhaps it has rust around the edges, and you can take and write a letter and look and see that letter in your mind. There's a percentage of the population that cannot do that. They're known as aphasic. They actually cannot visualize images in their head. And the inner world is so personal that people don't realize that. And then some people are hyperphasic, and like me, I could literally just be standing in a forest smelling the trees right now, and just like things moving around that I can see. So it's real, the muscles within me that allow me to visualize things are really strong. So that, I think, for this kind of work. But yeah, for me, it's I get into what you call an altered state of consciousness, I guess, or try to. A lot of traditionally cultures have used drums or kind of fast percussion to kind of trick the brain waves into that kind of loose and relaxed state where you can kind of visualize and have things surprise you. Well, from your subconscious or from the real other world, depending on how you want to look at it. Personally, I think it doesn't matter because the result's the same. But I try to put myself in that state, and then I write while in that state and just try to capture what I'm going through as I do it. And it took maybe 3 or 4 months to get all this down and to kind of go through this, interspersed with rituals where I would go and offer or maybe do some research. I did a lot of research on Idun early on, like the medieval Eddic poem that talks about her being the sister of the sons of Vivaldi and her relationship to the dwarves and some of that kind of stuff. So, you do a lot of that as well.
So I want to ask you one thing. You've separated the book into 3 sections, basically. Soul Travel is the first one. Then we have The Mad King, that's number 2. And then we have number 3, Gratitude. Do you want to talk a little bit about why these sections came up and what they mean?
Yeah, so I think it makes sense so Soul Travel, that portion is the more narrative version of it, where I'm chasing a dune, I'm going down into the depths of hell, I'm traveling, talking to my ancestors, just moving through forests and various landscapes, and then that sort of portion ends when I finally come to the clearing, where Odin is, and once I'm there, then I transition into the portion, which is, I like to call Odin the Mad King. There's the certain you want to call him Brosatru vision of Odin as like this horned helmet, armor clad, like, yeah, war, bah. But for me, there's certainly aspects of war about him, but he's this ancient, just mad, divine figure, and you go back to the roots of his name. Of course, he's got more names than I care to even research, but it's the root of it is the other, the madness, and I feel like, he was a psychopomp way before he was fit to the leadership role of the Norse pantheon. So for me, he's always that kind of mad, but also deeply old and wise character. So once I come to him, then that portion becomes him talking and me talking to him and kind of our interactions. And then finally, gratitude. I just wanted to wrap it up by calling out by name all the individual deities that I interact with in the poem. So that's basically just just a few lines of gratitude for each one, for allowing me, to some of their time and to at least work with. And again, you could look at it in the sense that I interacted with real physical deities from an ancient time, or you could look at the fact that I worked with deep subconscious elements buried in my psyche, have those same names and characteristics. I think either of those approaches is valid, as long as I think focusing on the result is key there.
Yeah. So it is, it does have a structure of a ritual in and of itself. You're building up towards a sort of a release where you're then interacting with the deity that brings you knowledge and insight.
And and again, I listen to Hylon like as much as anybody else. But honestly, when I first started getting into social media, I hadn't even heard of them. And that was what put me onto that kind of music and that kind of, so it actually almost took me by surprise the more I get into because I come from a background of following these deities in the past, and I kind of took a detour for Christianity like a lot of folks do, and that never really worked out. When I came back to this faith and started exploring it, there's you come across all these people that are operating now in the world, making music and telling stories in an almost ritualistic fashion. And again, I think I stumbled upon what I've made here, and it's surreal because I've written this book, and objectively I can look at it and say it's something like a Halong performance, like a ritual translated into text that people can experience. But I didn't realize that when I was making it. And honestly, I kind of step back sometimes and look at this thing sitting on my bookshelf like some alien creature that just showed up, had me write it, and now I'm talking about it. It's strange.
I personally think that's a really good way to come about doing things. Is that you haven't. There's so many people, I guess, that will see bands like Heilung and Wardruna and then try and imitate that in another form like poetry and kind of look at that and not copy it but very closely kind of influence themselves on it, whereas with you've kind of done it separately and then discovered that after, but it makes it very, to me anyway, it makes it very kind of true and honest and something different. And with the way that the Horns of Odin came about, things that come about like in that organic way always seem to last the test of time, in my opinion anyway.
In this era to try to service the likes and the trends, but that kind of stuff doesn't really fit, and I try to be real genuine in what I'm getting on about.
One thing I have to ask is, is there or was there any psychedelics involved in the writing? Because I
That's a
feel
good question.
like that would be an amazing thing, and you don't have to say if you don't want, but it was just something that I feel like I want to ask, because I mean, we spoke about it a little bit on the podcast before, and I think that without a doubt, you know, the throughout all human history, different civilizations will have been taking and experimenting with psychedelics and drugs. So I think a lot of the stories and the poems and everything comes from, you know, in that kind of space. So it would make sense if it did, but I also understand if you don't want to say it.
Well, it's interesting. I think that certainly there's a resurgence in psychedelics, which I think is fascinating, especially valid from a health treatment standpoint, because you know, and also there's certain natural substances and natural activities that generate these compounds as well. Generally, when I'm writing, I'm trying to stay sober, and I, in general, don't really drink or do much, and I kind of take a page from Odin's book on that, because in the Havamal, it basically says, "Hey, don't get wasted. You'll do stupid stuff." That's the real Cliff Notes version.
He repeats that a lot, actually.
Yeah, and it's funny because you have a lot of people that are like, "Hell, Odin, let's get drunk," and you're like, I don't think that's kind of, but you know, at the same time, you got to have fun. But
that's definitely a lesson I need to learn.
But on the psychedelic, there actually is a substance that's totally legal that you can get in the U.S. that will give you a mild hallucinogenic effect. It's called Mad Honey.
I had had this thought in my mind. I was like, imagine if he just says Christ now. I was like, the irony of it all would be brilliant.
It's called Jesus.
It's called Jesus Christ. I was like, fuck, please say that.
Have you heard the good news?
That would have been my favorite moment in the podcast ever if that had come out of your mouth.
No proselytization here, but it's basically from the Himalayas, and it is actually, again, to take it back to history, Xenophon, who wrote about the I think it's called the Anabasis, when basically he was part of this mercenary group that went to support a Syrian overthrow that didn't work out, and then all these Greeks had to flee across Asia Minor, I guess what's Turkey maybe now, back to Greece. A lot of people died. They stumble across a field of flowers that have the same compound in them, and they ate a bunch, and they had violent diarrhea and died. So that was bad. But they also got really happy, and that might be somewhat linked to the Odyssey's lotus flower sort of incident, if you think about it. But basically, there are these flowers that have these kinds of compounds in them that bees make honey from in the Himalayas, and it's not controlled. It's totally legal to purchase. Get on Amazon, look up Mad Honey, gets you some, and take a small dose, and it gives you a certain sort of euphoric effect. But again, in general, I try to
Mead on that.
Yes, I've heard folks talk about it.
Yeah.
But quick subject flip. I had some mead recently. And again, I don't really drink much, but it turns out when I'm around pagans, you kind of have to sometimes, because everybody's got some kind of fancy mead. Somebody had made ghost chili pepper mead, so they made mead with ghost chilies in it.
Okay, I really
it was
like
so
chili
good.
mead.
It was it burned like whiskey when you drank it. It was sweet, but then it would burn your throat like whiskey because of the capsicums, I guess, in the chili peppers. Man, that was a life-changing experience.
Chili mead, I really like. I imagine like a ghost chili as well would give you that extra little kick. I mean, I'm a big whiskey drinker as well, so
I actually drank it before a big ritual, and it really gave me a good kick. So
I bet.
I'm looking over at my mead over here that I'm brewing right now. I mean, I've got the whole mead brewing thing, and I got like 5 different like single gallon jugs that are currently just hanging
some chili
out.
in it.
I should probably throw some chili in it. But no, I'm just like getting more and more psyched about. So I mean, I've been doing academic stuff and learning academic stuff like most of my life, and now I'm getting really psyched about doing stuff that aren't just like happening in my head. that, but it actually exists. And like brewing mead is kind of like having a pet. It's like,
yeah.
Yeah, it
Every
is.
time I got you.
You got millions of pets, right? And they're
yeah,
all
millions of pets that you have like 10 to, and I talk to mead sometimes.
Matthias, have you ever heard of mad honey before? I guess I'm just thinking now whether could it be used to make mead, and could it, in that sense, then give maybe like a psychedelic effect from drinking it? It's not. I don't know anything about it, so I don't know what it is. Whether
it would be really expensive, I would
that.
say. So it's maybe $80 for a little bitty vial.
But I was more thinking
couple
maybe
tablespoons.
Back in the day.
Yeah, I was more thinking like back in the day. Is it something that could have?
I mean,
produced
it's
naturally.
I'm not a chemist, so I don't know if the active psychotropic compound in that like transfers from the flowers into the honey and then into the mead, if that would still be active. I don't know, but it's not impossible, I guess. There are so many different things. So first of all, really, what we need to do when we think about these things is to like leave this idea that modern ideas of drugs has like given us like, and I would actually say that modern war on drugs has given us a certain idea of what drugs are. It's like these illegal substances that you get busted for, except for in Oregon, because they just voted to decriminalize everything and legalize psilocybin.
Really?
Yeah, that's the real winner of the American election.
Yeah, psilocybin definitely won.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that will be interesting to see kind of what happens from there and the reaction.
I mean, it's really interesting to see in general that the American attitude to drugs is changing so rapidly. I mean, Denver has decriminalized mushrooms too. Some time ago. So this is like happening all over, and there are more and more states that are legalizing marijuana as well. But that aside, what I wanted to say is that there are so many different plants and mushrooms and other things out there that can give you some kind of reaction. That have some kind of psychotropic values. I mean, there's a there's okay. So in the Arctic, the Inuits have a particular type of food that you can only make by you take a seal skin, or you take a seal and then you skin it, right? And then you leave the fat on the inside of the skin. Then you sew that into a little bag. Then you take a bunch of ox. That's a certain type of bird that lives in the at least in North Atlantic Arctic. Then you throw them in there. You don't take the feathers off or anything. You just put them inside that bag that you've made of the seal skin. And then once you've filled it up, you sew it shut, and then you leave it hanging around for about a month in the shade. And then once you've done that, these birds will be nice and fermented. And I have heard that by eating those, you could get a little high too. Like, so that's another way that you can do that. And there's so many different ways in which you can achieve some kind of altered state of mind. And for some people, you don't even have to actually ingest anything at all. You can just like be a little bit crazy, right? We would call crazy,
I guess that's what they say about DMT, is that it's naturally inside your pineal gland, and I think, is it when you have a DMT trip, when whatever you take that's not what makes you high. It just unlocks your own personal ability to release the DMT. And I mean, I might be completely wrong on that, but I feel like that's something that picked up. So it's more of something that's within you already. You just need to kind of take something to unlock it, not add something to yourself, which is just shows that back 1,000 years ago, whenever, if you eat a certain combination of food, and it kind of gives you a little trip.
And it's the same with the drumming, right? As you mentioned before, Jason, drumming can also put you in an altered state of mind. Dancing can put you in an altered state of mind of some kind. And there are so many ways to do the thing that we call shamanic journey nowadays. And I think the most important thing is for the individual to find a safe and functional way of doing it. If you ask me,
I guess chanting, like you were just saying, the chanting and getting out of breath, and the lack of oxygen gives you a euphoric high. I guess that's the kind of thing that they've played on in the evangelical churches for a while. That kind of whipped up crowd hysteria of people.
Are you saying that what's happening in evangelical churches is because of lack of oxygen?
I think that's part of it. I think it adds to the whole kind of hysteria of things.
Yeah, I think when you look at it, different forms of ecstasy or ecstatic, events. That's just through all the history of man. That's all the way back to the beginning. Who knows how far back that goes?
Yeah, no, and that's it. It is 100% certain that these kinds of rituals were happening in Greek-Christian Scandinavia, and they might have even have happened in context of like that warrior ideology that emerges in the 500s, which is the ideology that places Odin on that throne of like some kind of war god and also god of kings and all that stuff. That was like so deeply tied to ideas of magic and ideas of what we now call shamanic trance and those kinds of things. This is also why I'm really focused on the structure here, because you take a soul travel first and you go through all of these realms and spaces in the world, and then you end up communicating with Odin, and that almost mirrors how I could imagine how these things could have worked out for people in ritual. In like, imagine this sort of like dark hall, like Viking hall, where you have fires burning in the middle. You have a bubbling pot of water that emanates steam. You have all the warriors seated along the sides, and you have the chieftain king, who's also basically his essence, his existence is merging with Odin in and of itself. Imagine just how he's wearing the Sutton Hoo helmet, because that looks fucking awesome. And Neil Price, the archaeologist, he worked with a group of reenactors in England to figure out how that helmet with the mask could work as an Odinic ritual prop. And they found out that there's some inlay of gold and ruby stuff over one of the eyes, but it's not on the other eye or something like that. And that means that it shines in the dark when it's like presented in front of a fire. So that's what one shining eye right there. That's the kind of stuff that these people were making back in the day, and they were using it for these kinds of rituals. When you wear that mask, your voice is muffled and different from what it usually is. And everybody is going to be drinking mead, probably, because that's such a stable substance in context of Odinic rituals. And just consider that the mead that they would be able to brew would not have a particularly high alcohol percentage. It would be fairly low, and still they would be able to. Still, they would consider this a substance, a magical substance that puts them in an altered state of mind. And that also tells you a little bit about the functionality of like these psychotropic things, right? That it doesn't actually have to be that potent for people to all of a sudden be transported to somewhere else. And so like that whole scene, that whole experience in essence right there, that would bring everybody into an altered state of mind, and an entirely different space, a mythical space, like this, the type of mythical space that's described in the mythology with Odin and his Einherja in this Valhöll, you know, that would be incredibly powerful. And once you've taken part in a ritual like that as a warrior, you're bound to want to kick some ass somewhere. Like, I'm sure that you feel very comfortable raiding England.
It's funny you mentioned that. I've actually participated in a ritual with about 30 other pagans recently, where it was an Odin's bloat. So the whole thing was just a gift to Odin. And when I had a bottle of 100, so we're in front of a fire and there's a stone up over it, and I have my bottle of a 151 proof wild turkey, which I'd brought because I knew there's gonna be a fire and I wanted to get something that would really burn. And when I stepped, you know, we're all giving our offerings and shouting at Odin and just kind of lighting up the sky. And when I step up on this big rock and I'm looking down at the fire, I kind of just lost it, and just went insane in the most best possible ways, and I'm just pouring it and I'm shouting, oh that. I started to chant, and they started, it was like a call and response where I'd say, oh, then they'd say it back. And finally I was like, oh, then take my voice. And I was chanting, and like I basically shouted until I didn't have a voice left. And it was a lot like that, but it was intense. Yeah.
But absolutely, I mean, it is that kind of that group mentality as well. There is something to be said about when you're with a group of your peers and you're all kind of doing something together. You do very much get whipped up into a frenzy and kind of almost a hive mind, even.
Yeah, it's definitely something.
I would say it's more than simply just like a group thing. It's I mean, I've also obviously participated in different kinds of rituals over the last like 25 more years of existing, and you know, there's something that happens, right? You can have a very sort of like solemn individual experience in that group as well. Like, you're not necessarily just like taken with the group. Something can happen for you, to you, so to speak, all by yourself, detached from what is otherwise going on in such a ritual. And I think that's part of the magic and interest in modern new pagan spirituality, is that it's really interesting to see, like, just from a scholarly perspective, to see what has happened with these groups over the last 4 or 5 decades. You know, you have people who are experimenting with figuring out how they can sort of like create their own contact with whatever you want to call it. You know, some call it the divine, others call it their subconscious or psyche, whatever. And it's sort of like it's a journey for everybody who gets involved with that to figure out, how do I do this, and where do I stand in context of these powers that I'm connecting with and talking to. And I think it offers a lot of freedom, actually. For people. This is also why we're seeing such a growth in these spiritualities here in the US in particular, a country that has been, you know, defined by certain very monolithic religions for a very long time. Now, the younger generations are like, I mean, who's not a witch nowadays? When you look,
right.
When you look around, like, and it means something. The point is not to like make fun of it or anything. It actually means something to a lot of people, right? That all of a sudden they're, you know, you're taking up you know, traditions that you can yourself define and also actually gain a lot from. And, you know, Nordic paganism, Nordic mythology is like a language for some for some people to work all of these things out. And this is, it's interesting, right? Because I think both culturally, but also like from an academic standpoint, we have a tendency to separate the neo-pagan stuff from everything else. Even neo-pagans do that, and it's really interesting that as a Scandinavian, I mean, we Scandinavians, we have had authors for the last 200-300 years using Nordic mythology to think with in different kinds of ways. We wouldn't call that neo-pagan. Like one of the most prominent ones, he was a Christian minister, Niels Frederik Severin Grundtvig, a Danish pastor, who invented early pedagogy in Scandinavia and didactics for schools. So he's one of the main reasons that Scandinavians are so familiar with Nordic mythology, because he basically said you have to introduce Nordic mythology to teach people things in general. Like he thought that was sort of like a venue for teaching the peasantry. This is back in the early 19th century. Teaching the peasantry things like math and spelling. Well, start with Nordic mythology. That was his plan. So he did, and that's why, and that's why that's still so present in school systems in Scandinavia. But aside from that, you have so many authors who have been using Nordic mythology and that past, the Viking Age past, to think with in different ways. The best example. Some of the best examples would be the Norwegian Hamsun, who definitely has like this past lingering somewhere in his subconscious when he's writing, even though he's a modernist who's like writing about a dude who's like hungry in Oslo in the late 19th century. It's an awesome novel. Dude just going crazy, basically. Later on, you see more of the Nordic mythology and all that stuff in there, but you can sort of like feel it throughout his authorship in general. I'm a big fan of his. Another guy is like Johannes V. Jensen, a Danish author who won the Nobel Literature Prize back in the 30s or 40s. I can't remember. He's a Darwinist in his approach. So he believes sort of, as people did in the early 20th century, believes in both like a spiritual and physical evolution of humans. I mean, he's also, as everybody else was in the Western world at the time, racist. So that's part of it. But he's creating some incredible literature when he's writing, and he's got a whole like sort of like developmental idea about the world and about the Danes and Scandinavians in general that is based off of Nordic mythology, and he's writing about themes that have nothing to do with Nordic mythology or the Viking Age or anything like that, but it's always like in the undercurrent of what he's writing. And so that's just to say, in so many words, I guess, that there are so many Scandinavian authors and poets who use Nordic mythology to think with in so many different ways. You also have contemporary authors who do this a lot, and that's because it's such an awesome system of thought. Basically, that's in and of its own, and that's why I'm also. I'm highlighting this because I would say that you don't need to be a pagan. You don't need to be a Norse-based heathen to enjoy this literature that you've written, Jason. I mean, this very much has a universal quality to it as well.
Yeah, I think if you and again, you look at stories like this. There's a reason myths endure. It's because they speak to timeless human experiences that we'll always have to deal with. Death, pain, suffering, loss, change. That's just across the board. But yeah, I like what you said there about not just Norse pagan or Norse mythology focus. My dream would be that 300 years from now, one of my books would be on somebody's shelf who has no relation to Norse paganism whatsoever, but just is really touched by the story and the language. That's like you look at Rumi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like every scholar's read some Rumi, but nobody's a Sufi. Nobody's a it's just something like that. That certainly would be a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there is some stories that just, like you say, stand the test of time. I recently just finished Sun Tzu's Art of War, and it's such an old book, but even now, even though we don't live in a warrior culture where it literally rings true, there are still things you can take away from it and twist and apply to modern life. So I guess just before we move off this topic completely, I just want to pull back to what you said earlier, Matthias, about like some people do kind of, I guess, laugh and ridicule sometimes at this kind of stuff, especially like with people saying, witches. And I guess even maybe with the book, Jason, in your experience, you get some people kind of have those opinions because they don't necessarily understand it. And it may even be some of the people that listen to this podcast for like the more mythology-based side of it and the history-based side, and they don't necessarily go towards the spiritual side. But I think it's very, it's fair to always remember that these are very personal experiences for people, and it's their experience, and it's not, it's never fair, in my opinion, to kind of laugh and downplay it, because they are these personal experiences, and if it happened to them, it happened to them, and if they're happy and they enjoy it and they believe it, then so what? Then that is how it should be. And it's not kind of, if it's not for you, it's not for you, but you don't have to kind of like laugh and ridicule and put your own opinions on it and kind of poke fun. So
I would actually attest something to that. Just as like religion is always extended between the serious and the ridiculous. This is where you always have to find religion. I'm very much personally believe in modern secular democracies as the best way to organize societies, and you can only do that if you, as somebody who has a religion or a spirituality, also don't take yourself too seriously. Like, and this is also, I guess, maybe sending a little thought to what has been happening in Europe lately. Some of the things that we're seeing in France and Austria and elsewhere. Yeah, guys, chill the fuck out, please. And this goes for right. This goes for everybody. It's like, yeah, have your beliefs, have your religions. Also, you know what? There's no reason to as an individual, go out and antagonize people's beliefs, of course. But it's on everybody to keep themselves in check.
It's that want to almost kind of like push your beliefs on somebody else, or I guess you do get it. You see so much on Facebook of like people just getting into arguments over such menial things or nothing, and they might, it might be a case of, I don't know. I was trying to pick a trivial subject, but it could.
There's none now. There's none.
Well, no, it could be. It could be. Let's say, like, this is going to be for anybody listening. This is the most British example anybody could ever give. It could be when you've got like a scone and you put either the cream on first and then the jam, or you put the jam on and then the cream. Now, you wouldn't believe the arguments that people have over that. Like, that is. I'm telling you, we will get messages over this because people go fucking mental over which way around, whether you put the cream or the jam first. But the point is that people get so attached to their ideas and the way that they do it, and the way that they do it is right, that everybody has to do it their way. And it's like, maybe you, going back to like the example, it's like maybe you like the taste of it with the cream on first and then the jam, but maybe somebody else just likes the jam first and then the cream. It's like, who the fuck cares? Like, you like what you like, and that, I think that can be applied to a lot of things. It's like, some people believe in Islam, some people believe in Christianity, some people are modern heathens, and it's like, as long as they're not hurting anybody, just let them just get on with it and fucking believe what you want. You don't have to tell somebody that they're wrong.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the same thing. You can laugh at somebody believing in. Say being a witch or believing in heathenry or something like that, and you can laugh at somebody being a Christian or Muslim or whatever. It's like I think it's important that we all, as human beings, learn to laugh at ourselves and each other, and if we do that, and we can approach that in good humor and with a sense of common decency as well, then things will be all right.
Absolutely.
And right now we're seeing the opposite, unfortunately.
Absolutely, we are.
With a lot of people.
So Jason, one thing I picked up from the poem, and one thing that stood out for me was your kind of description of hell. And I guess I just wanted to ask how you saw it on your journey, and then I wanted to kind of go over to Matthias and let him give us kind of like the scholarly side of how it is. In my opinion, or how I've always seen it, I've seen it kind of come across in two ways. One, in kind of the very much Christian kind of Satan, dark, evil place of like a, what you consider hell, and then almost like the opposite of that, and not being negative, is just kind of being the place where the people who were unfortunate not to die in battle would go and just hang out until Ragnarok. It wasn't necessarily an evil place.
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, and again, as a bit of a practitioner of the faith that involves this, and also based on my poetry, and also the lore, that we have, and the sagas, and what we can read of the literature on the subject, and also the overlay of Christianity on it. For me, when I was going there and writing this, there's the Long Bridge, which I think is, the bridge there is somewhat based in the literature, and just a long bridge to a dark place, and when I was down there, it was like there's all my ancestors, and there's a section of poetry there that where I'm down there and amongst the people that came before me, and that's just kind of how I see it, as kind of a dark, kind of cold place, maybe, certainly not hot or satanic, or it just seemed like a dark, cold place where you go, and the great tragedy of it is that we all go there, and again, in the poetry you see the figure I encounter there of Balder. I think is a powerful sentiment, and again, it's all myth and metaphor and deep meaning of universal experiences. But for me, it's the dark, cold place that everyone goes, and for the most part, and you can't leave, and it's sad, and we all know people that are in that kind of place. But there's Balder, the light of the Norse pantheon, who is also there, and almost to me symbolizes like the eternal hope in darkness. Why is the brightest? Why would the people who constructed these myths or discovered these myths within themselves or in the reality of the external other worlds, why would they place the brightest, most beautiful, kindest being in the darkest, deepest place? To me, it makes sense in terms of relating to all the suffering that we go through, and to know that there's hope in the darkness. And that's my general take on it. And then one small little nerdy tick mark to add on to that is the fact that I believe transmigration was somewhat around the Germanic peoples and the Celtic peoples and also the Nordic peoples. So I think there is some thoughts maybe that we could leave there and come back and try again. But maybe y'all can speak more to the historicity of that.
Yeah, I mean, Matthias,
and go.
Okay, so
I mean, just before you get onto like
just before I start ranting, yes,
just before you get to like the physical like area of hell and what it would be, you mentioned the long bridge, and I guess that's almost kind of like, I guess the Bifrost is what comes to mind. So Matthias, I just wanted to quickly ask, like, how much truth is there to like a Bifrost, or what is? Because I guess you see it almost like a rainbow bridge that connects the realms. I'm hoping this is a shorter subject for you to maybe just touch on it and give a little bit of info.
Okay, so there are plenty of bridges throughout the literature, throughout Nordic mythology. There's a Bifrost, which leads to the gods, as Snorri Sturluson tells us about that. It's also mentioned in poetry. The question is if it's really a bridge or if it's something else, and if it's really a rainbow or if it's something else. There's plenty of scholarly suggestions. For instance, a scholarly suggestion this, I can't remember. This Icelandic guy wrote an article about how it's actually the sea and not really a rainbow bridge originally. Was that Jon Neville Adelstein? So it could have been. I'm not entirely sure. Can't remember. But that's just one example of like how this has been interpreted. Now so in the story about Baldur's death, there's also a bridge to hell. It is described how Hermodr, Baldur's brother, goes to hell to try to get Baldur back, and that's where we get this. Hell says that, well, if everybody cries, then sure, and then we have one who doesn't cry, and on his journey there, Hermodr has to cross a bridge to get to the realm of the dead. And this is so very common for mythology and in general, and of course Nordic mythology in particular. We have multiple bridges all over the place for these kinds of places that you can't reach, and that's the point. You can't reach them as a living. And this is also, by the way, what Mothgudur, the figure who guards the bridge, says to Hermod. He's like, wait a minute, a couple of days ago, there was a whole army that came over here. By the way, keep that in mind, the whole army that came over the bridge, and you make more noise than they did. Because they were dead, whereas he's alive, right? Mm-hmm. So that's also something that's to take into consideration. The whole point of bridges, and by inference, therefore also rivers, and they're also mentioned typically the river Kjörk, which means the howling or something like that. They're also mentioned as a typical boundary between our world and the world of the dead. And the whole point is to basically, in sort of like a narrative, literary sense, mark them as unreachable places.
I guess that's something that kind of pops up in Greek mythology as well.
Absolutely, and standard English
sticks. I'm trying to show my knowledge here for one. I always feel so tentatively to say things. I'm like, is it this?
No, it is, and this is also, you can find this in just basic English literature from like the medieval period up until yesterday. There's so many examples of this. Like if an author wants to describe a realm that you can't really get to, right? Think of Harry Potter. What do you have to do in Harry Potter? You have to take your little that cart that transports all your luggage, and then you have to run into a wall, right? That's the same thing. This exact same idea that this is an unreachable place that you can only reach if you're special or dead, I guess. And Harry Potter's got it, and all kinds of literature has it. The Danish historian Saxo, the medieval historian, he has used images of hell to describe how Christianity comes to Scandinavia. And this starts with a journey where you have to sail all the way to the far north, beyond the stars and the moon and the sun, and then you get to this weird place in Bjartmaland, which is the actual name for northern Russia, and that's where you cross a golden bridge and you get to this guy called Gudmundur, and he will try to entice you, and all kinds of funky stuff, very devilish themes. He was also a Christian author. This is pretty standard, and the whole point is always to tell you that you can't reach there unless you're dead, or on some kind of magical journey, right?
Could that be maybe why, I guess, it's associated with the rainbow? Because the rainbow is kind of one of those things that you can just never get to. As a kid, I always wanted to get to that pot of gold at the end, but
we all.
Yeah, if you think about it, Rainbow Bridge can also be a kenning for something you can't walk on.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly also the point, right? And so, if it goes to sort of like the physical descriptions of hell, what we have to realize is that when we're reading a guy like Snorri Sturluson, his prose Edda, this is one of the themes that is so infused with Christianity, and for a good reason. Snorri Sturluson was a Christian. He was educated in at least like some learned culture of the 13th century. What he knew of the world was that it was, there was a heaven above where God sits somewhere. And we find ourselves somewhere in the middle, and then there's like 7 levels of hell, and people go to different places depending on what sin they committed, right? And that's why at the very bottom you have the devil munching on Judas, right? Judas goes to the very bottom of hell, and Snorri, when he's describing all of this, he uses that Christian cosmos. And he describes how Allfather, by the way, cast hell into the 9th level. So it's like even lower than Satan, I guess, where where the goddess Hel is then hanging out, and she rules over Niflheimr. And that literally, or Niflhel, depending on which sources we're reading, that literally means the mist world, or the mist underworld. So, and you know how we use the word nebulous. If something is nebulous, we don't know what we're talking about, right? And that's the whole point of saying mist hell. Again, for the same reason, Saxo, when he has people traveling to this other world, they also have to go through mist. This also happens all the time in the literature. So that's where you find that goddess. And that's where Balder then goes to when he dies, for a very specific reason. This is only Snorri Sturluson who tells us this, for a very specific reason. Well, what is Snorri Sturluson's general reasoning when it comes to the Nordic gods? Well, it is that they're humans. They're wizards who have tricked people in Scandinavia to believe that they are, in fact, gods. And this is not to take away anything from your interpretation, Jason. But what Snorri Sturluson is telling us when Balder dies and is placed in that underworld is that he's not a god. He is an evil wizard, just like Odin, just like Thor, just like all of these gods who have tricked people to believing that they're gods. And that's why he will go to the lowest levels of hell, right? So that's also why we get people interpreting the Norse underworld as some kind of like hell in a Christian sense. It's because there's a Christian telling us that this is what it is.
Right.
So is that the primary source for what we know?
Yeah, I mean, there are other sources that are telling us little bits and details, and you have to look into, like, for instance, the poem Baldur's Drömmar, or Baldur's Dreams. That's an Eddic poem that is about Odin going to the underworld to talk to a dead seeress of Völva, to gain knowledge about Baldur's death and all that stuff. That poem is likely to be very late. So composed in the Christian era, possibly by Christians, or most certainly by Christians, I'd say. And that poem follows similar like ideas of what the underworld is as Snorri Sturluson. And this is why this is so tricky. I mean, we can make sense of it today and rationalize it in the way that we want to, whatever we want to believe. But the person who's describing all of this, the main sources describing this underworld are Christian, and they're not just trying to give us an account of like what people might have believed. What they're trying to tell us are very important pedagogical, didactical things about Christianity. Actually, we're seeing Nordic mythology infused with one of the most important Christian concepts, cosmos, because cosmos in a Christian context demonstrates God's order. And and what that means is, of course, also things that Christians consider good and bad, right? So that's why it's so important for Snorri to fashion all of this in a Christian context rather than a non-Christian context. If we try to go beyond that veil of Christianity that he sort of like throws over all of these words and concepts, then what we probably had back in pre-Christian times, like these random Joe Smo Viking back in 800, what did he believe in? Right? He probably believed that he would go to some kind of afterlife that mirrored very much the life that he had lived. And maybe he attached that to the abode of a certain god. So for instance, if he was an avid Thor worshiper, he would go to Thor. There are some scholars who've also suggested that these things are gendered. So that women would go one place and men would go another place. I'm not particularly a fan of that idea. But this is based off this idea that we see in the poetry, Grimnismal in particular, where it says that Odin takes half of the dead and Freya takes the other half. Some have suggested, oh, that's men and women. I don't think so.
That would be a boring afterlife.
Right? Yeah. It's like, no way, man. No, so there are plenty of interpretations, but what you can also see, if you go beyond the literature and just look at the archaeology, what we have are thousands of graves from Scandinavia from this like period that we call the Viking Age, from before and so on, that are fashioned in accordance with what people believe the afterlife to be, right? So one of the things that that is very consistent up until Christianity shows up is that they put grave goods in the graves, right? They put all kinds of things in there. They give gifts and food and shoes and weaponry and tools and chairs and chests and tables and horses and dogs and there's even a peacock and, a lot of different things. Yeah. And this tells you one simple thing, and that is that people definitely believed that when you put a person down there in that hole in the ground, they would continue to live there with the things, right? And that's the real hell, right? That's also what hell means. Hell means the covered place. It's the same root as the word cellar, right? You know what a cellar is. It's a basement. It's a hole in the ground where you can't necessarily see what's going on. And we have so many different things going on too, like the chamber graves that are, that's a very specific Viking Age thing. It's a very urban Viking Age thing. Like they happened like in the 900s. Typically, that's where we have the majority of the chamber graves from. Around like Hedeby in southern Denmark, Birka in Sweden. Some of them are fashioned as houses. So like there's, for instance, in southern Denmark, there's one that's a house, like a nice little house, where you didn't have a woman that was buried there, and she was buried in a very specific way. She was tied to a chair as if she was sitting. And we have evidence, especially from a candle that has been used, that people went in there long after she had died, and then they hung out with her. And you just have to ask yourself, is this like a situation just like that Baldur's Dream story where Odin goes to the underworld and talks to a dead seeress? Because it definitely sounds like it, if you ask me.
Yeah, so that's heavy.
I think it's fair to point out that people didn't see death the way that we see it today. It wasn't like the negative.
No, absolutely not. No, and they had a huge, like such a rich, what you would call imaginary life around death in this period of time, where all kinds of things happened. Like you see graves that are being like constructed, right? You see some people getting buried. That's by the way the most common way to get rid of a body in until Christianity in Scandinavia. Like so from like up until like the middle of the 900s, back to the Stone Age, people burn, right? You cremate people, and that's it. But you do it in so many different ways. You don't always do it. Some people are retained for various purposes, I guess. Probably because of status too. Who knows? Like you could suggest that some individuals are buried as whole bodies because they were trying to preserve them. You never know. But what we see is that somebody gets burnt. Certain items like weapons are put in the grave, and it's usually a burial mound, right? They put a burial mound over the dead. Burial mounds that you can still see in the Scandinavian landscape today, and still today have like such rich histories and stories to attach to them. But anyway, you put the people in there, and then you put the grave goods with them, and sometimes people come back, and then they take certain items out, like weapons. And this is not grave robbers. This is people of the community, maybe even descendants of the person who died. They come back, and then they take a sword. And we have plenty of stories about, magical swords. I wonder if what we're dealing with here is actually a ritual in and of itself. Like, oh, we give this weapon with Grandpa, send him to the underworld with the weapon, and then we come back and take it. We have a story about that. Hervor, she goes and she conjures her dead dad or grandpa, I can't remember, but Angantir. And she's like, give me that sword, bro. And he's like, no. And he's like an evil spirit and all that stuff. But she gets it anyway. And then she like goes and is one of the best warriors ever.
I mean, could that be maybe if somebody was a particularly good warrior and they died, and obviously they were buried with their sword, and maybe 2 or 3 generations later, the stories have been passed down about how good of a fighter they were, to then go back and take the sword to somehow try and channel that ability almost.
Absolutely. That's the thing. Like, the idea is that the underworld is in and of itself a magical place. So that means added value to whatever item that you bring out from the underworld. And consider that our modern ideas of like the difference between living and dead are based off of this idea of clean, unclean that comes from Christianity.
It's that good and bad, isn't it?
It follows the same structure of good and bad. So unclean is, of course, bad. And this has been exacerbated by other things. Like, for instance, the cultural consequence in the Western world of discovering what bacteria are. That's why your mom's always been like, you have to wash your hands and all that stuff, right? That's part of this. This all like weaves together. And you know what? The best example of it is actually a Japanese mythology. You go to the origin story, right, where you have Izanagi and Izanami. A very, very strong split between the ideas of clean and unclean in male-female. Male is clean, female is unclean. Female belongs to the underworld and is associated with menstruation, death, disease, all of these kinds of things. That comes from the result of her giving birth to a fire god. I can't remember his name. And then she dies because of that, right? And the burns in her vagina, basically, are the result of, or are the cause of her dying. This is where you see that very strong split, and you can see that throughout Japanese culture as well. These very strong gender lines and all that stuff. That, of course, operates on different levels in multiple societies throughout the world, and there were certainly similar ideas present in pre-Christian Scandinavia. But what comes with Christianity is a very strong separation between life and death. And that's because Christianity theologically is based off of this very strong separation of life and death. Remember, in Christianity, you're actually not supposed to die at all. That's different in a pre-Christian context. People die. Now, the question is then, what happens to them when they die? And they have an afterlife. That's what we see in the Scandinavian context. They have an afterlife in the landscape, in the locality. That's why we still have folktales about the Huldur people that live in the mounds, right? That's the spirits of the ancestors. We just call it something else today because we've had so much Christianity involved, and then we became rationalists, and then we kind of think that it's a ridiculous idea to think about ancestors living in a mound right over there. That's the modern take on it, right? But it's still the same idea that exists in the folktale that was recorded in the late 19th century or the 20th century, as it was, for the person in the 1500s and the person in the 500s. Right? It's the same deal. So that's another thing to consider, that the euphemisms that lie behind the words that are being used in the mythology, they tend to just basically say, oh, it's the covered place. It's that place that's like nebulous to us. We don't actually know what it is. We just know that this is where our ancestors lived or live. And sometimes we go and give them gifts, and sometimes we go and, you know, take stuff back because we need it again, you know. So yeah, that's my long rant about that.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine
Yeah.
how powerful it would be to go to a mound and pull a sword out that your grandfather carried and be like, "Oh, we're under attack. Let's use
Right?
this," and taking it with you, and it's hoping it didn't rust. You might have to reforge it, but I can imagine that would be a very powerful feeling.
Right?
Quite Excalibur-esque as well. That
Exactly, and there's a reason for those stories too. I mean, that's where these stories about Excalibur and all that stuff comes from. Going back to this thing of like, did these peoples, the Celtics and the Germanic peoples, the Scandinavians and so on, did they interact and mix and so on? Hell yeah, they did. There's a reason that that you know, one of the biggest, most awesome silver chalices that have been found in Northern European history in the Danish area has Celtic imagery all over it, right? It's because there was so much interaction. Go to the Rhineland area, it was like a multicultural hub 2,000 years ago, where you have Roman, Celtic, and Germanic culture all coming together and, you know, becoming its own thing, basically. Oh, with a pinch of Egyptian and a pinch of Persian as well. Goddess Isis and so on.
It's hard to discount too the influence of the Roman Empire and the Roman economy on bringing all that together. It's just fascinating how that kind of came about, you know. Especially, I think there's some interesting parallels between the modern global world and everybody interacting and what Rome was doing back then with weaving everybody together. I can't imagine it's hard to imagine a Northern Europe mythology and kind of all the stories that we have without the backdrop of Rome kind of holding it all together back in the day.
Absolutely, and that's what we as scholars, like what we are always pointing out is that, the developments that take place from the year zero and onwards, actually a couple centuries before, in Northern Europe, are generally defined by the geopolitical movements of the Romans. That's really it. That's also what the mythology reflects, influence from Rome in different places. And, you know, this brings us to this like split between Christianity and not Christianity when it comes to the writing down of the mythology in the 13th century. Actually, what Snorri Sturluson and others are doing is not that different from what their pre-Christian ancestors did. It's just under, you know, or on new terms, so to speak. They're adopting Southern ideas, just like people did in the 500s and people did in the year zero. That's how it's always been for Scandinavia. It's still like that. Like, you know, like
you just kind of quickly mentioned the Egyptians, and we on the last episode we had Jeanette Warburg on, who mentioned about how obviously the sort of pre-Norse had the links with Egypt with the glass beads, and we were able to prove that. Is there any possibility that these ideas about death could have come up? It's just with the way you kind of mention it, it seems very Egyptian in kind of being buried with the goods and almost having, you know, going to another life that exists almost alongside what we have now.
Okay, let me give you an example. In Denmark, we have something called burger dressing. I've never seen that in the US. It is basically some kind of like Thousand Island dressing offshoot that's called American burger dressing. Yeah.
Yeah, we have we kind of have that over here as well, like an American burger sauce, like a relish.
Sounds like French fries.
Yeah.
And this is the same with, like, you could go to a Danish store and you could get a bag of chips called American barbecue, and it's got nothing to do with American barbecue whatsoever. American barbecue is 1,000 different things, and it's not on chips. I mean, there's barbecue flavored chips, but it's Anyway, the point is here that you have a thing, an invention in the United States, or maybe it even didn't come from the United States, but that's where it is. It's all of a sudden it turned into a very popular thing. The burger. The burger most likely came from Hamburg, hence hamburger. And there are even Danes that would claim that they invented it, but that's an entirely different cultural war. Anyway, the point is here.
I feel like that's your scone moment that I had earlier. You've just split the people.
How long I can talk about hot dogs and how it is possibly invented in Copenhagen and then taken to Hamburg, or possibly invented in Hamburg and then taken to Copenhagen. But I know that there's like a year between the first hot dog stands in the world, the first two, one in Copenhagen and the one in Hamburg. And we're still arguing over. Anyway, that's hot. Hamburgers. So the hamburgers are popularized in the U.S. and becomes a staple of American food. And this is like American. And then, Europeans at some point start copying that, American version of the hamburger. And that's how you get a new invention, which is the burger dressing. The American burger dressing that you can go find in any store in Europe. It's an interpretation of something that relates to a cultural product, in this case of food, from a certain region, right? That's how culture flows. That's how ideas flow. It doesn't matter if it's ideas about the afterlife or ideas about what you put on your burger. It's always like in this flux where you have, an invention that crops up in some area, and then it gets adopted over here and interpreted in its own cultural context, and then moved to another place where it's interpreted in its own cultural context, and so on and so on and so on. And so, for instance, burial mounds, they're all over Atlantic Europe. They're in the British Isles, they're in Scandinavia, they're along the coast of northern Germany, the Netherlands, France, Spain, getting into the Mediterranean in Italy, and so on and so on. And of course, this is some kind of like cultural complex that relates straight to the idea of building pyramids. Ultimately, it has its own context in Northern Europe, but it probably has its origins in the idea of building pyramid monuments, of course. Like, why wouldn't it? Especially if you can follow the trail through the Bronze Age, the Stone Age, through the Bronze Age, and so on through coastal Europe. Then you go to, let's say, Central Russia, and in Central Russia you also find burial mounds. Question is, did they come from the same origin? Maybe. It's not impossible, but they could also have had their own context. It's not impossible that humans come up with similar ideas independently of one another. That's definitely also a possibility. But when it comes to coastal Europe, I'm pretty certain that the Europeans generally belong to the same grave culture as you find in North Africa and the Mediterranean, and also in the Middle East as well. So that's how these things work, right? And they have their own context wherever you find them, but they belong to like this wider complex of similar thoughts. And that's the same with the gods too, right? So you have gods that migrate between cultures and peoples and take on their own flavor depending on where they get to.
Perfect. One last thing I want to ask is, like, just to pull it back to kind of like the death and where you go. I guess firstly would be, what would your opinion be on what hell would look like to kind of like the average quote unquote Viking or person living in Scandinavia? Like, would it be like a dark place? Would it be kind of just a place where people hang out that died of old age, I guess? And the other thing I wanted to ask was about is it the Ättestupa, which is That was one thing that I've been wanting to ask for episodes and episodes, and I've not found a place to fit it in until now.
Fair enough. Ättestupa.
I only know about that from Norsemen on Netflix, and I have no problem admitting that either.
That's the hilarious go-to my mind has with this as well. The reference point is definitely that scene in Norseman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so first of all, like, what would hell have looked like? I think it probably looked like that, sort of like dark, dank place. That's kind of the idea that we get from a broad range of the sources.
I keep getting like a cave image then from both what you and Jason said, kind of like that cold, wet, damp kind of. It's like a cave.
But you have to consider if these people thought that the afterlife in some way or another mirrored the existing life, right? Then they would also furnish the afterlife in the same way. This is not what Snorri Sturluson does, right? He tells us like the knife is called hunger, or the dish is called hunger. I can't remember, and the bowl is called famine, and like the entrance is called stumbling block, which is just so embarrassing. But like he does whatever he can to furnish it with this sucks, whereas the opposite is of course that warrior paradise that he frames for Odin and his warriors, which again I'm sorry to say, but that's his invention more than anything else. Valhalla.
You've just broken so many people's hearts.
There are so many crying prostitutes out there right now.
Oh my god!
Don't worry, they're not crying.
Hear the hearts breaking now.
No, they're sharpening their pitchforks and lighting their torches. No, so Snorri, it takes like this very weird, elusive stanza from Grimnismal that tells us something like Antrimnir has Seirimnir boiled in Eldrimnir. And Antrimnir means that which cools the spirit or which freezes the spirit or something like that. Seirimnir means that which freezes the ocean, and spirit and could also just mean air. And Eldrimnir, that which freezes the fire. And that is what he fashions into like the cook named Antrimnir, who boils Seirimnir, which is a pig, in Eldrimnir, which is a pot. This is like Snorri Sturluson takes something that is like incredibly deep and mystical, and then he turns it into a fucking cartoon. To furnish Valhalla with a boar that is never going to get depleted from bacon. Thanks a lot, bro.
Endless bacon. Let's do it.
Yeah, no,
I mean, sounds good to me.
but I mean, what the stanza really ends with is few know what the Einherjar actually eat. So Snorri Sturluson says the exact opposites of what the stanza actually says. The stanza says, we don't know what these dead warriors eat. And then Sturluson says, oh yeah, I do. Bacon. So that just tells you he's very busy constructing, basically like structuring, furnishing, and setting up a nice, cool warrior paradise with a burning fire pit, with endless food and endless beer and endless fighting, right? Because he's trying to tell us that that's like the Viking version of God's paradise. And that's of course because the Vikings, they are heretics, right? They don't understand true Christianity. And so the opposite to this is of course this dreary hell where nobody gets anything to eat and your servant is lazy and you stumble in there and everything is like dank and dark. Now consider this. basically comes down to what you think of life, how you think of death, right? Your ideas of death and what the afterlife is are most likely defined by what you think of life. And this says a lot about the Christian attitude to death and the idea that, it's better in the afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
We have no way of knowing if that's what people thought in pre-Christian Scandinavia. We don't know if if maybe based on the grave goods, we could suggest that they thought it was the same. If that's the case, then every afterlife has a nice little fire pit and food and drink, and your family's there, and everybody's not happy and enjoying life in this little grave mound over there. If they thought life was better than death, then they could have fashioned it as some kind of like dreary afterlife that sucks. It's hard to tell because the sources are so complicated on this particular issue. In other cases, the sources aren't that complicated, but on this issue, because it's so important a subject to Christianity, it's complicated to figure out what people might have thought. But goes to the Greek mythology and sources that have been touched less, I guess, by Christianity, are telling us that it mirrors the way that people lived. Odysseus, right? What he sees in the death realm is an afterlife that seems perhaps a little darker, but nonetheless very similar. Like Achilles is still a badass, ruler and all that stuff in the afterlife. So that's probably most likely how people saw it in pre-Christian Scandinavia. But I mean, essentially, after ranting a very long time, we don't know, and it's complicated.
Nice.
There we go. Yeah,
anytime, also.
Sorry, go ahead.
Anytime anybody brings up Achilles, I have to mention that he wasn't all that great. And that Diomedes should get more media, I think. Yeah, that was a guy.
No, I mean, Achilles, like, he spends most of the Iliad just like whining in his tent.
Yes.
But so Daniel, just to cap all of this off, you asked about the Ättestupa.
That's it. Then let's wrap it up after that. It's getting on a little bit.
It's a long rant. Okay, so the Ättestupa is a phenomenon recorded in the late 1700s, as far as I remember, in Sweden and Norway. The idea that older members of the family were sort of like encouraged to off themselves, basically, like commit suicide when they couldn't work any longer. And
because it was so that they weren't a burden.
Yes.
On the group.
Yes, and so there are variations of how this would take place, but so you basically find a very tall cliff. Either you jump off or you put on a little wagon, and sometimes there's a lake at the bottom, sometimes there's not, and then Grandpa is like put on that little wagon. Oh, and I think they also gave him some tobacco as sort of like hey, smoke a pipe on your way down, and
wow.
Yeah. So the question is this real, or is this sort of like these tales of like silly isolated villagers somewhere? And it's probably a little bit of both, to be honest. They've probably been exaggerated. I would say it's just like it's very likely that Scandinavians have always, in times of dire need, put a newborn out in the bog. It's probably also very likely that, Grandpa did get pushed off a cliff at some point.
I guess it would make sense that if resources were low and you had elderly people who couldn't pull their weight, as cruel as it sounds, in a time where it's just another mouth to feed, it would kind of make sense that that would happen.
So that's the thing. I mean, you have to ask yourself under what circumstances do these kinds of things happen. And I am sure that there are plenty of farms and communities where, if somebody suggested that, they'd get their ass kicked because we're not doing that to Grandpa. But I'm also...
Depends if Grandpa's an asshole or not.
That's another thing. Like, if Grandpa was an asshole, of course. I mean,
I bet there's plenty of people who'd like to throw their mother-in-laws off a cliff.
My point is simply, it probably is. You probably shouldn't be like, oh, this is like something that always happened when a person reaches a certain age. That's when it happens. It's probably more like, certain circumstances warranted it. Certain, conditions.
Okay.
An asshole, and so on. Right? Desperation has pushed people to a lot of different things, and it's not like it goes back to 19th century England, and consider how many infanticides there would be in the Thames. Like, how many baby bodies would you be able to fish out of the Thames, or the Thames, or whatever you call that river?
I had no idea what you were saying then.
I know.
I was like, what the fuck is the Thames?
The Thames.
the Thames.
Yeah. Whatever. That river. My point is, like, you would find a lot of dead people in that river.
Oh, I think you'll find all sorts in there.
Yeah.
So I guess the Ättestupa isn't Viking as such. It's a much...
No, I mean, it's like the idea is that, oh yeah, the Vikings of course did it too. I mean, what we have from the Viking Age, both like in the Scandinavian law material, like, so the early medieval laws prohibit putting children out, which means dumping them in a lake. And we also have a Arabian emissary, Yaqub al-Tattushi from Spain, who comes through in Denmark, who says that they do this. They put their children out. So, sorry, I've had a sneeze. Trying to, like, it's like been lingering for like hours now. Anyway, so he says that they throw newborns in the ocean, and again, like, some might have done that. That's not impossible, especially when you find it prohibited in the law codes. Probably means that, in pre-Christian times, that was something that people did. Now, was it something that people did a lot? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, if it was something they did all the time, I wouldn't be here, because that would effectively cut off any future generations of Scandinavian.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, another mouth to feed that you can't afford. It's not improbable.
Have either of you seen the film Midsommar?
Yes.
Which is so that's kind of by the director who did Hereditary, which is kind of about Scandinavia, isn't it? And there's a very graphic scene in that which kind of depicts an elderly person jumping off onto a big rock. Yeah. I mean, that movie is all kinds of fucked up. To loop back to psychedelics, it's kind of one of those. It's a good film though. It leaves you. I think it leaves you. It's not so much a horror film in the sense of like a traditional kind of jump scare, but it definitely left me kind of like emotionally uneasy, emotionally kind of I didn't know how to feel after that film finished.
I would say one thing, like, so to begin with, I was like, oh, this is just a crappy ripoff of The Wicker Man,
right?
Like in this Scandinavian setting, but I've like sort of warmed up to it over the years now, because I would actually say it's a much better version than The Wicker Man. After having watched The Wicker Man just recently, actually, again.
Yeah, I think it for me, it definitely left me feeling just that little bit. I don't know what it was. It was just something that left me very uneasy and kind of emotionally, just kind of like, what the fuck? But it was. I thought it was a brilliantly made film. It did its job. I definitely recommend it, Jason, if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, it sounds deeply uneasy. So I'm in.
Yeah. No.
Oh yeah, it's a brilliant film.
just take note of the light in the movie. As a horror movie, that's probably the most unsettling thing. It's just sunny all the time. Like,
yeah,
you know,
there isn't any dark moments.
No, and as a
but it's
Scandinavian,
just,
I can tell you that never happens anywhere in Scandinavia.
yeah. That's it though. It is just very much. It's not. There's no particularly. There's one graphic scene. There's not very much that happens like traditional horror wise. It's just a very plays on your feelings very much, and it's
very creepy.
yeah. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Let's wrap this one up. Thank you to everybody for listening. If you enjoyed it, please just take a moment to leave us a review, hit the subscribe button so obviously you find out when the next episode comes out. Obviously we have our Patreon as well, which you can support us on. I'm doing a live question answer with the artist, the Saxon Storyteller, tomorrow, which should be pretty fun. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of bonus material on there that you get for helping us out a little bit, helping us make the show even better. So Jason, yeah, if you just want to let people know where they can find you, your work, obviously your social media, that kind of thing.
Sure. I guess for the spectrum of support, the easiest place to find me is Instagram, where I post poetry and maybe other ritual stuff there about every day, at Wandering Yggdrasil. I trust this audience can spell that.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I'll share it as well anyway, just to make sure.
And then the next level up, of course, my book is out, The Oath, A Heathen Poets Journey. Amazon has finally recognized me, so the search engines don't just return Halloween Jason stuff. So it shouldn't be too hard to find. Also, my Instagram's got all the links. And then the last level of support, I've got a Patreon. Jason Ralls or Wandering Yggdrasil should find that. If you want to jump on there and help me move on to the next book, and kind of, I've got a little community that I'm still amazed that they support me. It's again surreal, but I've got a little community on there that like to join me. So that's
awesome. It. Yeah, and I mean, the book can. Is it just an online or is it a physical copy?
Just physical copy for now. With poetry, it's just hard to. It was hard to get some kind of format that would fit on a Kindle or something where there wouldn't be bleed between pages and stuff. So just try to keep the experience. Plus the bind rune on the cover, I feel, is really significant, and so it's a physical article that hopefully people can have in their homes for now.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a chat after and see it getting some for us to stock, and then people can grab it from our shop, which makes it nice and easy, I guess, as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And like I say, it's hopefully been a fun one for people to listen to. We covered a bunch of subjects. Oh, Mathias, forgot about you there.
You're fine. Don't worry about it. Yeah, you can always find me on Instagram under my name, which is Nordvik. You can find me on Facebook with the Nordic Mythology channel page that I sometimes upload stuff to. Mm-hmm. You can also find my website, www.nordicmythologychannel.com, where I sometimes post rants on my blog. The most recent one is my take on the German show Barbarians, or Barbaren, as it is called in German.
That sounded Scottish.
Really?
That sounded incredibly Scottish to me, anyway.
Well, I don't know. Maybe my German accent is getting more Scottish than the longer.
maybe.
I wouldn't be surprised at this point.
Perfect. Yeah, you can. So obviously, you can find me through the company at Horns of Odin on Instagram, and also at Daniel_Farrand1 as well on Instagram. That's my personal Instagram, mainly just pictures of me in the gym. So yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you very much, Jason. And yeah, take care.
Thank you.